He came in uniform, proud but alone, only to be turned away at the door of a Valentine's gala meant for lovebirds. But one woman saw not just the Marine but the man who'd been waiting to be seen. If this story touches your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who still believes in second chances. The sharp lines of Jack Halston's dress blues caught the reflection of the streetlight as he stood by the curb, adjusting the crease in his trousers. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine, his medals aligned with military precision, and the silver bars on his shoulders gleamed under the February moonlight. He took one final breath before heading up the steps of the Brookhaven Community Center, the building aglow with soft red and pink light from the paper hearts in the windows. A banner stretched across the entrance read, "Valentine's Gala, a night of love and laughter." It had been 3 years since he lost his wife, Melissa. 3 Valentine's days he had spent alone, 2 of them actively avoiding the calendar. This year, he'd convinced himself it was time to try something different. Not for romance, not even for company, really. Just to be somewhere other than the echo chamber of his own house, to stop watching shadows move through the living room where no one else breathed. He wasn't sure what made him put on the uniform. Maybe it was the way Melissa used to say he looked proud in it, or maybe it was his own quiet hope that the person he used to be, the man of discipline, purpose, and pride might still be tucked inside. He'd worn this same uniform to retire from the Corps, to bury comrades, and to deliver folded flags into grieving arms. Tonight, he wore it for himself, for whatever dignity he had left to carry. The warmth of the community center rushed out to meet him as the door opened, laughter spilling into the night. Jack gave a polite nod to the pair in front of him, a young couple holding hands and giggling like high schoolers, even though they were well into their 40s. As Jack stepped forward, the volunteer at the check-in table looked up. She was young, maybe 25, with red lipstick and a glittery headband shaped like hearts. Her eyes dropped from his face to his uniform, and then quickly darted away, landing on the clipboard in front of her. "Hi there," she said, her voice cheerful but practiced. "Name, please?" "Jack Halston," he replied, his tone even and courteous. She flipped through the list. Her smile remained in place, but her fingers slowed. After a moment, she looked up with a gentle furrow in her brow. "I'm so sorry, sir, but this event is for couples only. It's a Valentine's-themed gala, so it's a paired registration." Jack blinked once. It wasn't the words that stunned him, it was the way she said them, with the same tone someone might use when explaining to a lost tourist that the museum is closed on Mondays. He nodded once and forced the smallest smile. "I see. No exceptions?" She offered him an apologetic shrug. "It's just how it's set up. We're trying to keep the dance floor balanced, you know?" Balanced. He wasn't sure what that meant in the context of love or grief or the kind of evening that asked for people to forget everything else in the world. "Of course," he said, and stepped back. He turned on his heel, keeping his posture upright, even though something inside him sank like a stone. Outside again, the winter air nipped at his face and crept into his collar. The distant echo of music-some slow, jazzy numbers lid through the door before it clicked shut behind him. He didn't know why it stung so much. It wasn't as though he had come expecting to be swept into some magical night. He'd simply hoped to be among people, to remember what it felt like to laugh and not feel out of place. His fingers curled slightly at his sides, the tightness in his chest too familiar to be surprising. Then, before he reached the bottom step, he heard a voice behind him. "Excuse me," the woman said, her tone rich and clear, like velvet warmed by firelight. He turned, startled, and saw her descending the steps toward him. She wore a deep red dress, simple but elegant, the kind of thing you could only wear with confidence earned over time. Her silver hair was pulled into a loose updo, soft tendrils framing her cheekbones. Her eyes held something he hadn't seen in a long time. Not pity, not politeness, but recognition. "I couldn't help but overhear," she said, stopping just a few steps above him. "They told you it was couples only?" He nodded once, not sure what else to say. That's nonsense, she continued. You stood for all of us. Tonight, let me stand for you. Jack didn't reply right away. He wasn't sure if it was the words, or the ease with which she said them, or the quiet strength behind her offer that rooted him to the spot. He studied her for a long breath, noting the steadiness of her posture, the way her hand extended without hesitation. I'm Evelyn, she said, her voice softening. I came alone, and I'd rather not leave that way. Jack looked at her hand. Then he looked at the door behind her, the place he'd just been turned away from. Slowly, he placed his hand in hers. It would be my honor, he said. Her smile widened, not showy or dramatic, just enough to reach her eyes. They walked together back up the steps, side by side, as if it had always been the plan. When they reached the check-in table, the young woman blinked at them. Evelyn tilted her head and gave a small, regal nod. This is my guest, she said, then turned toward the ballroom. Inside, the lights were low and warm, the music drifting into the soft rhythm of a ballad. Red ribbons swayed gently from the ceiling, and couples spun slowly on the floor, lost in their own worlds. Jack felt Evelyn's hand guide his gently. Let's just dance, she said. He swallowed, nodded once, and stepped into her lead. The music wrapped around them, and as they began to move in time, Jack realized the ache in his chest wasn't just grief. It was the terrifying, unfamiliar sensation of beginning again. But in that moment, under the soft lights and quiet music, it didn't feel quite so terrifying after all. Evelyn Hart had always believed that grief could be quiet and dignified. But tonight, as she watched the Marine turned away at the door, she remembered that grief could also look like a man standing tall in his dress. Blues, trying not to flinch as rejection slid in where welcome should have been. She had seen the moment it happened, the slight shift in his shoulders, the half-second pause before he turned. That was not a man surprised by loneliness. That was a man who had learned to live alongside it. She hadn't planned on dancing tonight. She had shown up in her red dress because that's what her late husband used to say made her look like fire. My firecracker, he'd call her. She still heard him sometimes when she walked past old places, still felt him in the way certain songs made her sway without thinking. She hadn't come tonight looking for company, not really. She'd come to remind herself that being alive meant participating, even if only as a witness to other people's joy. But when she saw the Marine, when she heard the chill in the way that poor girl told him couples only, something in her heart rose up. Not pity, not charity, just the bone-deep knowledge that sometimes someone has to make the first move towards something kinder. Now, inside the ballroom, she moved with ease through the crowd, her hand still lightly looped around the Marine's arm. His name, she had learned, was Jack Halston. He said it with a quiet formality, like it still belonged to someone in uniform. There was a tightness in his smile when he said it, a kind of distance, but his hand had been steady when he took hers. That steadiness had moved her more than any words. The ballroom shimmered with soft pinks and warm golds. Candlelight flickered in tall glass cylinders on every table. Music drifted through the air, the melody smooth and easy, like something from a better time. Couples danced in that slow, swaying way that spoke more of comfort than performance. Evelyn guided Jack toward the edge of the floor. She could feel his uncertainty even without looking. His posture was perfect, his movements precise, but she could sense the question in him. What am I doing here? She turned to face him fully and offered her hand again. Let's just dance, she said, and smiled as she said it, hoping he would hear what she meant. Let's forget everything else. Let's exist for one song. Jack looked down at her hand and then up into her face. He nodded, and his hand met hers. It was larger, calloused, strong in the way of men who have spent a lifetime holding the weight of things too heavy for others. She led him gently into a slow rhythm, not a complicated step, just a simple side-to-side sway that allowed them both to breathe. "You've done this before," she said quietly, half teasing. "A few times," he answered, voice low. "Not recently." She chuckled. "That's all right. Tonight, we're just moving forward and back." He nodded, and they settled into a rhythm. For a while, they didn't speak. Evelyn liked silence when it was shared without discomfort. Jack didn't crowd her, didn't rush. His frame offered structure without pressure. He moved like someone always calculating space and duty, like someone who'd been trained to lead but had learned to follow when needed. It was, she thought, a rare kind of grace. "You served a long time?" she asked eventually. 30 years, he replied. "Mostly overseas. Finished my last tour 6 years ago. Retired shortly after." She could hear the weight in that word, retired. It didn't mean what it used to mean for men like him. She imagined the routine of it all, the rhythm of days built around service, stripped away in a matter of weeks, the emptiness that could creep in when duty no longer filled the calendar. "My husband was a firefighter," she offered. 32 years. We used to joke that the sirens followed him home. He passed 8 years ago." Jack looked at her. Something softened in his eyes. "I'm sorry," he said, and she knew he meant it. "Me too," she replied. "But love like that, it doesn't vanish. It just changes shape." Jack gave a quiet nod, his eyes searching hers for understanding. "My wife passed from cancer 3 years ago. She was the bravest person I ever knew." The music shifted, but they didn't stop dancing. Their steps adjusted naturally, as if their conversation had synced with the melody. Evelyn held her posture, let her hand stay right where it was on his shoulder, light but steady. "What was her name?" she asked gently. "Melissa. What would she say if she saw you here tonight?" Jack let out the faintest laugh, more breath than sound. "She'd say I waited too long to get back out in the world. She'd probably say I should have shaved better." Evelyn smiled. "She sounds wise." "She was," he said, and then paused before adding, "and kind." The music faded and shifted into something a bit more upbeat. Couples clapped lightly and switched partners or returned to their seats. Evelyn stepped back, not releasing his hand entirely, but giving him the option to part. Jack surprised her by not stepping away. "Would you like to sit for a bit?" he asked. "I'd love to." He walked her to a nearby table near the floor, pulled out a chair for her with that unmistakable marine precision, and sat across from her. A waiter came by offering sparkling cider in tall flutes. They accepted. Evelyn sipped hers and watched him as he scanned the room, not tensely, just with the awareness of someone who always looked after others before himself. "It's strange being in places like this again," he said after a while. She nodded. "I know what you mean. People don't always know what to do with us. We're reminders of what's gone, of what lasts, of what's hard to say out loud." Jack leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "I thought I was past needing this kind of connection. Thought I could make peace with being alone." "Did you?" she asked. He took a moment, then shook his head. "I tried, but peace without warmth feels a lot like waiting for something that doesn't come." Evelyn reached out and touched his hand, not dramatically, just a small, human connection. "Then maybe tonight isn't about filling a void. Maybe it's about honoring the people we've loved by choosing to feel something again." Jack looked at their hands, then up at her. "You always speak like that?" "Only when it matters," she said, her eyes glinting with something close to mischief. He laughed then, a real sound that reached his eyes for the first time. And just like that, something subtle shifted between them. Not a declaration, not a spark too large to hold. Just an easing of two people into a new possibility. The music started up again. Another slow number. Evelyn stood, smoothing the front of her dress. "Well, Marine," she said, offering her hand again. "Shall we?" He rose without hesitation. "Yes, ma'am. Let's dance." And this time, There was no uncertainty in his step. The second dance felt different. Jack noticed it almost immediately. The first had been tentative, marked by the kind of hesitation that came when two strangers agree to share space for the sake of comfort, or maybe politeness. But now, there was something else in the way Evelyn moved beside him. Her steps were more fluid, more trusting, and he felt himself respond in kind, adjusting his hold on her back, letting his shoulders ease. The music wrapped around them like a ribbon, tying them together in a moment neither of them had planned for, but now seemed unwilling to leave. Jack was not a man given to talking during dances. In his younger years, when Melissa had begged him to take lessons before her cousin's wedding, he'd memorized the steps with military efficiency, but said little during them. Talking, he felt, disrupted the rhythm. Yet with Evelyn, the silence felt like a warm place, not an empty one, and when he spoke, it didn't come from obligation. It came because he wanted to share the space with more than just movement. "You're very good at this," he said, his voice low and genuine. Evelyn tilted her head slightly and smiled, the corners of her eyes crinkling. "I used to teach, before the world tilted and grief became my companion." He nodded, understanding that quiet confession all too well. "You make it look effortless." "That's only because I learned to stop leading people who don't want to be led," she said, her tone playful but honest. Jack gave a soft laugh. "That sounds like it took time." "Oh, it did," she replied. "Years, and plenty of bruised toes." They moved in small circles at the edge of the dance floor, careful not to drift too far into the twirling orbit of younger couples whose laughter filled the air like wind chimes. Jack noticed how Evelyn's dress swayed around her ankles with every step, how the candlelight from the tables caught in her silver hair. She was elegant without effort, dignified without pride, and though she had not said much about herself, Jack found himself quietly trying to piece together the story behind her eyes. She glanced at him, her voice softer now. "You said earlier your wife passed from cancer?" "Yes," he replied. 3 years ago this spring. It was a long goodbye." "I know that kind," she said gently. "My husband's death was sudden. A fire in a 3-story building downtown. He went in for 2 kids on the 3rd floor, got them out, then the roof collapsed." Jack felt the weight of that hang between them. It was the kind of story that made silence stretch, but not uncomfortably. It was reverent, like standing at the edge of a grave not yet covered in earth. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he adjusted his hand slightly on her back, a subtle reassurance that he heard her, that he honored the pain she carried without needing to dissect it. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "Thank you," she replied, not with sorrow, but with clarity. They continued moving to the music. Jack noticed that the people around them had shifted. Some were watching, not rudely, not with gossip in their eyes, but with a kind of quiet admiration. Perhaps it was the sight of a man in uniform, or perhaps it was the way Evelyn met every gaze with calm confidence. Whatever it was, Jack began to feel the stiffness in his spine ease. For the first time in a very long time, he didn't feel like a relic of something that no longer mattered. He felt like a man still allowed to be part of the world. "Do you come to these often?" he asked as the music faded. "This is my first time in 3 years," she said. "I used to come every year when Robert was alive. After he passed, it just didn't feel right. Until tonight." Jack glanced toward the entrance, remembering the look on the young woman's face when she turned him away. "They nearly sent me packing. They were trying to protect the tone of the event," she said with a shrug. "Love and laughter," they said. "They forget that sometimes the most meaningful laughter comes from those who've earned it the hard way." He looked at her then. Really looked. There was nothing brittle about her. She carried her grief like a shawl, draped loosely but always present, and yet there was warmth beneath it. A pulse that spoke of someone who had decided not to be frozen by loss. He realized he admired that more than he could express. A new song began. Faster now, a bit more playful. Evelyn raised an eyebrow, holding out her hand again. "Do you trust me?" He hesitated, but only for a breath. Then he took her hand. "I do." She led him into a spin that surprised him. He fumbled slightly, but her laughter came like a balm, and he found himself grinning. She guided him through a quick step that brought back memories of crowded wedding floors and holiday parties long gone. Jack wasn't as fluid as her, but she made space for his stiffness and turned it into rhythm. When the song ended, they were both slightly breathless, smiling. Evelyn leaned closer and said, "You're better than you think." "I'm rusty," he replied. "You're real," she corrected. They made their way back to the table, this time walking side by side without the need for arm hooks or formal gestures. Evelyn reached for the cider again, and Jack followed. He sipped and glanced around the room. He hadn't expected to enjoy this evening. He had almost driven away the moment he parked. Now, the thought of the night ending came with a twinge of something unfamiliar. Regret? Evelyn seemed to sense it. "The night's not over," she said. "Not unless you want it to be." He looked at her and asked, "Do you?" She shook her head slowly. "No, I don't." Jack set his glass down and leaned forward, elbows resting on the table. "You ever think we get signs? That sometimes people show up when we're about to give up on a certain part of ourselves?" Evelyn smiled and touched the base of her glass with one finger. "All the time. I just stopped expecting them to come dressed in full military honors." Jack chuckled and said, "And I stopped expecting them to come in red dresses and rescue me from a lonely walk home." They stayed at the table for a while longer, talking about everything and nothing. They shared memories of their spouses, of holidays that still stung, of small joys like old songs and burnt toast. Somewhere in that conversation, the walls between them thinned. Not in a dramatic, cinematic way, but in the kind of slow unfolding that happens when two people finally decide they're allowed to speak without armor. When the band announced the final song of the evening, Jack stood and held out his hand without needing to ask. Evelyn rose, took it, and together they stepped onto the dance floor one more time. The music was soft again, slow and full of longing, and this time their steps were more certain, less restrained. They moved, not as two people unsure of what they had found, but as two who had begun to trust that what they found might be real. Neither of them spoke. The music said enough. Sunday morning came with a hush that only a small town could keep. The streets were still damp from the light rain that had passed through overnight, and the sky hung in a gentle overcast that made everything appear softer. Jack sat at his kitchen table, a cup of coffee cooling between his hands, untouched. The house was quiet, just as it always had been since Melissa passed, but something about this morning made the silence feel different, not heavier, just more noticeable. He kept seeing Evelyn smile, the way her eyes had softened when she talked about her late husband, the way her fingers had rested so lightly on his shoulder when they danced, the way she had made space for him without asking for anything in return. Jack didn't often feel surprised anymore, but something about her had moved past his guard before he even realized it was happening. Last night had been a gift, unexpected and oddly graceful. Still, he hadn't expected anything beyond the music and the shared stories. He reached for the folded napkin he'd stuffed in his jacket pocket the night before. On it, in elegant handwriting, was a note. "Meet me at the old pier. Noon. Evelyn." He stared at it for a long while, thumb tracing the ink as if it might smudge into something deeper. The pier. He hadn't been down there in years. Melissa used to love walking along it in the fall, bundled in her favorite green scarf. They would buy coffee from a nearby bakery and watch the water sway below them. He didn't know if he could return there, or if he even should, but the thought of Evelyn waiting alone made the answer clear. By the time he arrived, the sky had begun to lighten, the cloud cover slowly breaking into slivers of blue. The pier extended into the lake like a quiet promise, wood planks slightly warped with age but still sturdy beneath his boots. He saw her standing near the edge, leaning against the railing with her back to him. She wore a light wool coat in soft gray, her hair pulled back loosely again, strands lifting in the breeze. In her hands, she held 2 paper cups. He slowed his steps so as not to startle her, but before he could say anything, she turned. "I was beginning to wonder," she said, a smile touching her face. Jack stepped closer, returning the smile. "I almost didn't come." "But you did," she said, offering him one of the cups. "Black. I took a chance." He accepted it, grateful for the warmth that passed into his fingers. "You guessed right." She turned back to the water, and he stood beside her, close enough to feel the edge of her sleeve brush his. The lake moved in slow rhythm beneath them, wind drawing thin ripples across the surface. Ducks paddled near the shoreline, and in the distance, a small fishing boat drifted with idle patience. "This place used to feel like something sacred," she said, not looking at him. "Robert and I came here often, when life got loud. When grief came, I couldn't bring myself to walk out this far again. But I thought, if anyone would understand what it feels like to return to a place that once held joy and now holds ghosts, it might be you." Jack nodded, letting her words settle. "Melissa and I used to come here too. She liked the bakery on the corner. Thought their cinnamon rolls could solve any argument." Evelyn laughed softly. "I think we had similar wives." "Strong-willed," Jack said. "Beautifully stubborn," she added. They stood there quietly for a while, sipping their coffee and letting the air work its way into their lungs. Jack could feel something loosening inside him, a kind of tension he had grown so used to carrying that he barely recognized it until it started to fade. There was no pressure here, no need to perform or explain. Only presence. "I used to believe that love could only happen once," Evelyn said after a time. "That anything after would be imitation, a shadow. But lately I've begun to wonder if that belief is just another way of protecting ourselves from pain." Jack thought about that for a long moment. "It feels disloyal sometimes, to move forward." "It does," she agreed, "until you realize that carrying love forward doesn't mean you're leaving anyone behind." He turned to look at her then. She met his eyes without hesitation. He saw the loss there, still vivid, still tender. But he also saw the strength that had carried her to this pier, to this moment, and something inside him recognized it as a mirror. "I wasn't expecting you last night," he said. "I wasn't expecting to say what I did at the door," she replied. "But something about the way you turned, like you'd already decided to accept being alone. I've seen that in myself, and I couldn't let you walk away without trying." Jack swallowed and looked back out at the water. "I've been alone a long time, Evelyn, and I've learned how to live with it, but that doesn't mean I like it." She stepped closer, enough that their shoulders touched. "You don't have to like it. You just have to believe that there might be more." He looked down at her hand, resting near his on the railing. He didn't take it, not yet. But he didn't move away either. "Would you like to walk?" she asked. He nodded, and they turned to stroll slowly along the pier, their steps easy, unhurried. The boards creaked beneath their feet in familiar tones. As they walked, they spoke about things that had nothing to do with death or loss. She told him about the dance classes she used to teach at the senior center, how some students came for the steps but stayed for the company. He told her about the veterans' breakfasts he sometimes attended, though he never stayed long. They talked about music, about old movies they both loved, about little rituals that still carried them through the quiet days. By the time they reached the end of the pier again, Jack felt lighter. The wind had picked up slightly, pulling at Evelyn's hair. She brushed it back and laughed when a strand clung to her lip. "You always carry yourself like you're still on duty," she said, half teasing. He raised an eyebrow. "Is that a bad thing?" "No," she said, shaking her head. "It's comforting in a way. But you're allowed to be off duty too, Jack. You're allowed to just be a man standing beside a woman on a Sunday morning." He smiled at that, small but sincere. "I'm trying." "I can tell." She reached out then, not with hesitation but with calm certainty, and touched the inside of his arm. "This doesn't have to be anything more than it is," she said. "But it can be, if you want it." He looked at her, at the soft resolve in her face, the steady invitation that asked for no promises and offered only presence. "I'd like that," he said. "I don't know how to start again, but I'd like to try." "Then we'll try," she replied. "Together." The wind rose gently around them, and the water beneath the pier moved with slow patience. Jack felt her fingers wrap around his, and for the first time in a long while, the silence did not feel like an echo. It felt like a beginning. Jack stood at his kitchen counter, sleeves rolled up, eyes fixed on the skillet in front of him. The smell of garlic and onions filled the air, warm and familiar. He had not cooked a full dinner for someone else in years. Cooking for himself had become a routine, something mechanical to keep the hunger at bay. But tonight, there was purpose behind the chopping and stirring, and intention in every step. He had invited Evelyn to his home for dinner, and she had said yes without hesitation. He checked the oven timer, wiped his hands on a clean dish towel, and looked over the table he had set with quiet care. 2 plates, cloth napkins, polished silverware, and a small glass bowl of floating candles in the center. Nothing extravagant, but everything deliberate. He had even opened the curtains, letting in the fading light of early evening. The sky outside glowed with the last gold of the sun, and shadows stretched across the wood floor like long arms reaching for peace. His house had never been big, but it was tidy, kept the way Melissa used to like it. After her passing, he had resisted changing much. Her favorite chair remained in the corner, and the bookshelf she had organized by color still stood just as she left it. Over time, though, the space had become more his own, not by removing her, but by allowing himself to step back into life. Tonight, that step felt more real than any other. When the knock came, he took a steadying breath and walked to the door. Evelyn stood on the porch, wearing a deep blue dress beneath a soft cream shawl, her silver hair gently pinned up. She carried a small bundle wrapped in a cloth napkin. "I brought dessert," she said with a smile. "Strawberry shortcake. My specialty, if you don't mind, slightly lopsided biscuits." He stepped aside, offering a smile of his own. "I'll take slightly lopsided over store-bought any day." She stepped in and paused, taking in the space. "It smells wonderful in here. You didn't have to go to so much trouble." "I wanted to," he said, then added, "It's good to have someone to cook for." She looked around, noting the family photographs on the mantel, the framed service medals beside them, the worn books that lined the hallway. "You keep a beautiful home." "It's quieter than it used to be," he replied, "but tonight it feels a little fuller." They settled into the kitchen, Evelyn placing the dessert on the counter while Jack served the chicken and vegetables he had prepared. The meal was simple, rooted in the kind of comfort that came from roasted potatoes, sautéed greens, and good bread. They ate slowly, savoring not just the food but the company. The conversation moved easily, back and forth like a gentle current. They shared stories of their childhoods, their first jobs, the ways the world had changed since then. After dinner, Evelyn helped carry the plates to the sink. Jack moved to wash them, but she placed a hand on his arm. "Let them wait," she said. "Dance with me." He looked at her, surprised. "Here?" She nodded. "Right here." There was no music playing, no melody to follow, but she stepped closer and held out her hand. He took it, and together they moved into the open space between the kitchen and the living room. He placed one hand on her waist, the other holding hers, and they began to sway, slowly, quietly, to the rhythm of their own hearts. Jack closed his eyes for a moment. In that space, he could almost hear music, not from a speaker, not from a radio, but from memory. The kind of melody that lives in a person after loss, the kind that reappears when the soul begins to lift again. Evelyn's hand was warm in his, and her presence beside him grounded him in a way he hadn't felt in years. "You're good at this," she said, voice near his shoulder. "I had a good teacher," he replied. "Melissa loved to dance, said it was the only time she could get me to stop thinking." "Smart woman," Evelyn murmured. They continued moving, slow and steady, the air around them still. Outside the window, the first stars appeared, faint but sure. Jack opened his eyes and looked down at her. There was something calm in her gaze, a kind of peace that didn't ask for explanations. He realized, in that moment, that she was not comparing him to anyone. She was not looking backward. She was here, fully, entirely. He stopped moving and let the moment settle. Evelyn looked up at him. "You all right?" she asked. He nodded. "More than all right. I just haven't felt this in a long time." "What is it?" she asked, her voice kind. "Hope," he said. "It feels like hope." She leaned in, resting her head against his chest. He held her there, steady, feeling the way her breath rose and fell. It was not the kind of embrace that demanded anything. It simply was. When they parted, they didn't speak. Evelyn walked over to the counter and uncovered the shortcake. Jack fetched 2 small plates and forks, and they ate together at the table once more. The dessert was delicious, sweet and just a little tart, with a kind of handmade texture that spoke of care, not perfection. "You were right," Jack said. "Your specialty." She laughed softly. "I aim to please." As the evening wore on, the light shifted again, settling into that deep softness that comes just before night fully takes hold. Evelyn rose and moved to the bookshelf, trailing a finger along the spines. "You read a lot of history," she observed. "Mostly military," he said. "But lately I've been trying to branch out." "Any fiction?" she asked. "Some," he said. "I'm learning there's more to life than facts and strategy." She turned to face him. "Fiction teaches us how to feel." He stood and walked over to her, hands in his pockets. "I'm still learning that part." She reached out and brushed her fingers against his cheek, gently. "You're doing just fine." They stood there for another moment before she moved toward the door. "I should let you rest," she said. "It's been a full evening." Jack nodded, though a part of him didn't want it to end. "Let me walk you out." At the porch, the air was cooler now. Evelyn turned to face him. "Thank you for tonight," she said. "For everything." "You gave me something tonight," he replied. "More than I knew I needed." She leaned in and kissed his cheek. It was not hurried or uncertain. It was quiet, certain, and full of warmth. When she stepped back, she smiled. "Good night, Jack." "Good night, Evelyn." He watched her walk to her car and waited until the taillights disappeared down the street. Then he stepped back inside, closed the door, and leaned against it for a moment. His house, though still quiet, felt different. He looked at Melissa's photo on the mantel. Her eyes sparkled in that frozen frame, the way they always had when she teased him about dancing or burned the toast on Sunday mornings. He walked over and touched the edge of the frame. "Thank you," he whispered. Then he turned off the lights and stood at the window, the stars above flickering in the night. Somewhere in that silence he felt something stir. Not the end of grief, not the forgetting of love past, but the beginning of something that might grow beside it. Something new, something alive. Claire Hart was not the kind of daughter who withheld her opinions. She had grown up watching her mother live with honesty, speak her truth plainly, and never allow grief to rob her of grace. So when Evelyn told her she had been spending time with a retired Marine she met at the Valentine's gala, Claire's silence was not hesitation, it was evaluation. She stared across the table at the little cafe they had chosen for lunch, her fork barely grazing the salad she had barely touched. Evelyn sat across from her with calm eyes and good posture, the kind that came from years of carrying herself with dignity through rooms that didn't always see her. "A Marine?" Claire asked finally. "That's not a name, Mom." "Jack Halston," Evelyn replied, folding her napkin neatly in her lap. "He served 30 years. He's retired now." Claire took a breath, tried not to react too sharply, and focused her energy on remaining measured. "And how long have you been seeing him?" "A few weeks," Evelyn said. "We've had dinner, walks, conversations." "Is it serious?" Evelyn tilted her head slightly. "Does it need to be serious for it to matter?" Claire dropped her fork. "I just don't want you getting hurt." or tangled in something that's more about memory than it is about a future. I'm not a teenager, Claire, Evelyn said, her voice steady. And Jack isn't a stranger. He's a man who's lived through loss. Like I have, he understands things most people don't. Claire didn't answer right away. She sipped her water, eyes narrowing slightly. You haven't let anyone in for a long time. Because the ones who tried didn't feel right. Jack does. Claire looked down at her plate and finally spoke without lifting her gaze. Dad was a hero. I know that, Evelyn said. No one ever replaces him. But when you talk about Jack, it's like you're forgetting. No, Evelyn replied gently. It's because I remember. Love doesn't disappear, Claire. It changes, and if I'm lucky, I'll have a second chance at something beautiful. Claire sighed and leaned back in her chair. Then maybe I should meet him. Evelyn smiled softly. That's a good idea. The following Saturday, Jack stood outside the same cafe, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket, eyes scanning the small parking lot as he waited. He had never met the daughter of a woman he was courting before, and the word itself still felt too new to settle in his chest. Courting. It reminded him of things from a different time. But that was the only word that seemed to match what this was: deliberate, slow, real. He saw Evelyn approach first. She was walking beside a younger woman, tall, sharp-featured, with the kind of eyes that saw everything. Claire. There was no hesitation in the way she walked. Her stride was confident, but her expression unreadable. Jack straightened and stepped forward. Evelyn smiled, and he returned it, but his attention stayed on Claire, knowing her approval or lack of it would set the tone. Jack, Evelyn said warmly. This is my daughter, Claire. He extended his hand. Nice to meet you. Claire shook it, firm and quick. Thanks for making time. Jack nodded. I appreciate the chance. They went inside, sat near the window, and ordered drinks. Claire folded her hands in front of her, leaning forward slightly. So, 30 years in the Marines? She asked. Jack nodded. Yes, retired 6 years ago. Infantry and logistics. My dad was a firefighter, Claire said. 29 years. Died in the line of duty. I'm sorry for your loss, Jack said sincerely. He sounds like a man of courage. Claire nodded, her expression still carefully composed. He was. There was a pause. Evelyn sipped her tea, watching both of them. Do you have children? Claire asked. Jack shook his head. No, my wife and I couldn't. Claire's expression softened slightly, and she glanced at her mother. Mom said you lost her a few years ago? Jack nodded. Cancer. Took us both by surprise. She fought hard. Claire leaned back in her chair, studying him. My mom is the strongest woman I know. I want to be sure whoever she lets into her life knows what kind of heart she has. Jack met her gaze evenly. I do. She gives people everything, even when they don't deserve it. I won't take her for granted, Jack said. And if this doesn't work, then I'll be grateful for every moment we had, but I won't disappear without respect. Claire nodded once, slowly. All right. The conversation turned lighter after that. Evelyn shared stories from her dance classes, and Claire eventually relaxed enough to laugh. Jack spoke of a recent volunteer project at the Veterans Center. There was warmth at the table, not instant familiarity, but the beginning of something mutual, cautious and real. Later, as they stepped outside, Claire pulled Evelyn aside for a brief moment. He's quiet, Claire said. But honest. Evelyn smiled. Yes. Claire looked at her mother, and for the first time that afternoon, her guard dropped. Just be happy, Mom. I'm trying, Evelyn said, and kissed her daughter's cheek. That night, Evelyn called Jack to thank him. You handled her questions well, she said. She's protective, Jack replied. That's a good sign. She was a teenager when Robert died. She saw too much of me falling apart. She never really stopped being on alert. Maybe now she can start to relax. I hope so. There was a pause on the line. Not tense, just filled with something unspoken. "I meant what I said," Jack told her. "About not disappearing." "I know," Evelyn said. "And so does she." They sat in that silence together, the kind that no longer felt like a test. Jack looked out his window at the evening sky. Somewhere across town, Evelyn was doing the same. The past still lived inside both of them, but for the first time, it felt like the past had a place behind them, honored, but not in charge. In its place now stood something else. Not quite a future, not quite a promise, but the shape of something taking root. Respect, patience, and the smallest spark of something daring to grow. On Tuesday morning, Jack arrived early at the Veterans Center, the way he used to arrive for roll call, 5 minutes before everyone else, shoulders squared and chin lifted. The smell of old coffee and faint antiseptic greeted him as he walked through the double doors, the familiar creak of the floor under his boots giving a strange comfort. He hadn't volunteered in months, maybe longer. After Melissa died, he drifted away from most things that tethered him to other people. Service projects, weekly check-ins, even poker night with the other retirees. It had all become too much effort for too little return, but now something was shifting inside him. Evelyn had said it plainly, without pushing, just one evening at dinner. "You still have a lot to give, Jack. You don't have to stop giving." So here he was, clipboard in hand, signing up for meal delivery to homebound veterans and a weekly maintenance shift. He asked for the physical jobs. The ones that kept his hands moving and his body sore in a good way. The volunteer coordinator, a woman named Carla who had known Melissa, greeted him with cautious enthusiasm. She had learned not to push, but her eyes lit up when she saw his name on the board. "You coming back for good, Jack?" she asked as he filled in the form. "I'm not sure," he replied, "but I'm here today." "That's more than most," she said. "You want the Friday run?" "Give me the longest route," he said, then added, "and a heavy toolbox if you have one." She laughed. Some things never change. That afternoon, Jack found himself repairing a fence in the back lot of one of the center's properties. The slats had warped and come loose in the winter storms, and the elderly man who lived there, a retired Navy cook named Reggie, sat on the porch sipping sweet tea and offering unfiltered opinions about every nail Jack hammered. "Looks like you're finally out of hibernation," Reggie said. "We all figured you disappeared." Jack drove another nail into the wood and looked over his shoulder. "I did, but I'm back." Reggie nodded. "Grief'll do that. Makes ghosts out of living men. You seeing someone?" Jack raised an eyebrow. "What makes you say that? You're standing straighter, wearing that decent cologne, and you're humming." Jack blinked. He hadn't realized he was humming. Something soft and old. A song from the radio, maybe, or maybe something Evelyn had played once. He smiled despite himself. "I met someone," he admitted. "We're figuring it out." "Well, don't let her get away," Reggie said. "Life's short, and the heart don't beat for free." Later that evening, Jack showed up at Evelyn's dance class. She had mentioned it in passing during their last walk at the pier, something she still taught twice a week for seniors at the local community hall. He hadn't said then whether he would come, but now he stood outside the doorway, watching through the glass as she led a small group through a slow foxtrot, her voice calm and clear as she counted the steps. She moved with such quiet assurance that it almost startled him. Seeing her like that, in her element, he realized how much she gave to others. Not with grand gestures or dramatic speeches, but in small ways, correcting a hand position here, encouraging a nervous laugh there. She saw people, not just their posture, not just their rhythm, but their need to be seen. He opened the door, and her eyes met his instantly. A flicker of surprise, then warmth. She didn't miss a beat. Just motioned for him to come in and called out to the class. "Looks like we've got a guest. Jack, do you want to learn to lead?" He approached with a chuckle. "I thought I already knew how." She grinned. Then let's see what you've got. He joined the circle, a little stiff at first, but his military poise served him well. Evelyn paired him with a woman named Grace, whose arthritis slowed her steps but not her spirit. She teased him every time he tried to take control of the pace, and by the third pass he had softened into the rhythm. You're not bad, Grace said, but you need to stop counting under your breath. Force of habit, Jack replied. I've always liked knowing where my feet are. Well, sometimes they'll surprise you, she said with a wink. That's the fun of it. Evelyn came to check on them midway through the class, giving Jack's shoulder a light touch before gently correcting his hand placement. He adjusted, grateful, and felt something ease between them again. It wasn't romantic in that moment. It was something deeper than that, a shared understanding of building trust through presence, of letting connection grow where silence had lived for too long. After class, she walked him to his truck. I wasn't sure you'd come, she said. I wasn't sure either, he replied. But I'm glad I did. You did well. I kept stepping on Grace's toes. She's tough, Evelyn said. She liked you. I liked her too. They stood beside the truck for a moment, the soft hum of night stretching around them. Streetlights flickered on, and the stars blinked through the thin clouds above. Thank you for showing up, she said. I'm trying to make that a habit, he said, then paused. Do you feel like this is real? You and me? Evelyn didn't answer right away. She looked up at him, her expression calm. I do, she said. But I also know it's fragile. Not in a weak way, in the way all new things are. It needs time. Jack nodded. I can give it time. They said goodnight, and he drove home with the windows cracked just enough to let in the night air. When he walked into his living room, he didn't reach for the television or the books on the shelf. He just stood there for a moment, letting the quiet settle around him, and realized that for the first time in years, the silence wasn't asking anything of him. It wasn't hollow. It was full of memory and the beginnings of something new. He picked up the phone and called Reggie, telling him he'd be back next week to finish the rest of the repairs. Then he sat down at the kitchen table, pulled out a notebook he hadn't touched in months, and started making a list. Places to take Evelyn. Songs he wanted to learn to dance to. Projects he could do with the other vets. Books Melissa had once mentioned, the ones he never read. The list wasn't long, but it was a beginning. The next morning, he woke early, dressed with care, and as he left the house, he caught his reflection in the hallway mirror. The man looking back at him wasn't the one who had been turned away at the gala. He wasn't the man who walked through his days like a shadow. He was a man who had begun to live again, slowly, but with purpose. And in every step forward, he carried not just the past, but the strength to shape something new. Claire didn't call first. She showed up at the Veterans Center on a bright Thursday afternoon, stepping through the glass doors as if she were walking into a courtroom. Jack had just finished restaining a set of worn picnic tables out back, and his hands were still marked with streaks of oil and varnish. Carla waved him over from the front desk with a smile that didn't quite hide her curiosity. There's someone here to see you, she said. Looks like it might be family. Jack turned the corner and found Claire standing near the reception area, arms crossed, face unreadable. Her hair was pulled back neatly, her coat crisply pressed. She looked like someone who lived by schedules and logic, someone who liked answers before questions were even asked. Jack wiped his hands on a rag tucked into his waistband and approached slowly. Claire, he said, careful with his tone. I figured it was time I saw you again, she said. Not as a daughter, just as a person trying to understand the man who's getting close to my mother. Jack gestured toward the back exit. Want to walk? She nodded. Outside, the sun was warm but softened by a cool breeze. They strolled past the picnic tables and toward a row of trees that bordered the property, the air filled with the scent of pine and fresh wood. Jack didn't rush to speak. He had learned that some things needed time to come to the surface. I saw the way you looked at her, Claire said finally, like you were still weighing whether you were allowed. Jack exhaled through his nose. That's fair. She's strong, but she's also tender. I watched her build herself back after we lost my dad. I helped her tape up the boxes she couldn't open. I sat with her on the anniversary dates when no one else remembered. It took her years to stop glancing toward the front door like she expected him to walk back in. Jack nodded. I understand. I've done the same. Then maybe you understand why I needed to see this with my own eyes. Because if she's going to open her heart again, it needs to be with someone who doesn't treat her like a second chance. Jack stopped walking and turned toward her. Claire, your mother is not a replacement. She's not a chapter after something else ended. She's her own book entirely. Claire studied him for a long time, her expression tight. Do you love her? I'm starting to, Jack said. Not out of need, out of choice. She looked away, blinking quickly. She said you took her to your wife's grave. I did, Jack replied, because I wanted her to see that I come with history. I wanted to show her that I'm not hiding it, that I'm not ashamed of loving someone before. Claire nodded slowly. She said you didn't ask her to compete with it. I never would. They kept walking, letting silence take over again. A squirrel darted across their path and disappeared into the brush. Birds called from the trees above, filling the space with soft, natural music. My father was the first man I ever loved, Claire said. He was stubborn, loud, opinionated, but he always came home. He taught me how to drive stick, how to patch a roof, and how to walk away from anything that didn't respect me. He sounds like a good man, Jack said. He was. And Mom loved him with everything she had. So, if she's laughing again, if she's humming while she folds laundry, if she's going back to her garden and dancing barefoot in the kitchen, then I want that for her, even if it scares me. Jack smiled gently. I'm not here to take her away from that love. I'm here to add something new beside it. Claire stopped walking and looked up at him. Her eyes, so guarded when they first met, now held a flicker of something softer. I hope you mean that, she said. I do. She extended her hand. Then we'll see what happens. He shook it, firm and steady. Not as a gesture of formality, but of mutual respect. As they walked back toward the building, Claire glanced over her shoulder at him. My mom thinks you're brave, she said. But I think you're just good. And sometimes that's harder. Jack didn't answer, but her words stayed with him long after she left. That weekend, he invited Evelyn to visit Melissa's grave with him again. Not out of ritual, but because he wanted to share that space, not just once, but as something he trusted her to walk through with him. The cemetery was quiet that morning, the grass freshly trimmed, the headstones standing like silent sentinels against the early light. They walked hand in hand to the small granite marker beneath a flowering dogwood tree. Jack knelt for a moment, pressing his palm to the cool stone. Evelyn stood beside him in silence, offering her presence instead of platitudes. When he stood, she placed a single daisy on the grave. I never met her, Evelyn said, but I know what kind of man she married. That tells me something. She would have liked you, Jack said, not just for who you are now, but for how you carry what you've lost. Evelyn nodded, brushing her hand along the petals of the flower. Love doesn't fade, it changes shape, and sometimes it reaches forward through us. As they walked back toward the car, Jack slipped his hand into hers again. It was not a declaration, it was a gesture of faith. That night, Evelyn sat with Claire at her dining table, sipping tea while the soft hum of jazz played in the background. Claire listened quietly as her mother spoke of Jack, not with the rush of infatuation, but with the steady admiration of someone rediscovering warmth after a long winter. You trust him? Claire asked. I do, Evelyn replied. Not because he's perfect, because he's present. Claire smiled. Then I do too. Across town, Jack sat on his porch, watching the stars. His boots rested on the worn steps, a mug of coffee cooling beside him. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was waiting for something to end. He felt like he was standing in the middle of something just beginning. He reached for his notebook again, flipping past the lists and notes, until he found a blank page. At the top he wrote, in neat, careful letters, what it means to be seen. And beneath it, he began to write not about Evelyn, not about Melissa, not about grief or guilt, but about the simple, sacred power of choosing to open your heart a second time, and the courage it took to let someone hold it. Jack stood in front of the mirror, tugging once more at the lapel of his dress blues, then stepped back to take in the full view. It had been exactly 1 year since he was turned away from the Valentine's gala. He remembered every detail of that night, the polite rejection, the ache in his chest as he turned to walk away. And then Evelyn's voice, clear and unwavering, calling out to him with an invitation that had changed the course of his life. He adjusted the angle of his medals, then brushed off an invisible speck of dust from his sleeve. The uniform still fit him the same, maybe a little looser now from all the long walks and meals shared with Evelyn, but it still held its shape. It still reminded him of who he had been and who he still was at his core. Tonight, he was not attending alone. And more than that, tonight's gala was different. The community center had reworked the invitation process after last year's quiet controversy. It was no longer couples only. The event had been rebranded as a celebration of love in all its forms, romantic, platonic, remembered, and rediscovered. It had become a place for people of all ages and stories to gather, to move together beneath the soft lights and soft music. The idea had started with Evelyn. She had spoken to the planning committee, gently but firmly, and shared what had happened to Jack last year. Not in anger, not to shame anyone, but as a way to remind them that love was not something you could box into pairs or tickets sold in twos. Jack had offered to stay out of it. He didn't want the attention. But Evelyn had insisted that silence was the beginning of exclusion, and that kindness deserved a voice. The result was a shift in tone, a new welcome message printed on every ticket. Come as you are, dance if you want, you belong here. When Evelyn stepped into his home, Jack stood from the chair in the living room and turned to greet her. She wore a floor-length gown in deep wine red, with a delicate silver scarf draped around her shoulders. Her hair was swept up, with soft curls falling around her face, and the moment Jack saw her, he smiled. You look beautiful, he said. She returned the smile, walking over to him with easy confidence. And you, Jack Halston, look just as dignified as the first night I saw you. They stood close for a moment, both taking in the weight of what this night meant. It was not just an anniversary of an event. It was a marker of the quiet resilience that had built between them over the last 12 months. Evelyn reached up and pinned a small boutonniere to his lapel. It was a single white rose surrounded by green ivy and a sprig of baby's breath. Simple, elegant, full of intention. There, she said. Now you're ready. He kissed her hand softly. Let's go make new memories. They arrived at the community center just as the first notes of music drifted into the street. The parking lot was full, and the entrance was lined with paper lanterns that glowed in soft pinks and golds. A banner hung above the doors again, this time reading, Brookhaven Valentine's Gala, for all hearts. Inside, the space had transformed into something breathtaking. Dozens of tables lined the outer edges of the dance floor, each with a small arrangement of candles and flowers. String lights crisscrossed overhead, casting a gentle light that made the room feel like a dream. The scent of fresh blooms and warm chocolate drifted through the air. People mingled easily, some dressed in suits and gowns, others in simple cardigans or khakis. No one seemed to be looking for labels. There were couples, yes, but also old friends, neighbors, single parents with their children, widows sitting together at shared tables. It felt like a homecoming more than a formal affair. As Jack and Evelyn stepped through the doors, the crowd took notice. Heads turned. There was no awkward silence this year, no confused glances from the check-in table. Instead, a wave of warm recognition spread. Someone began clapping, and soon others joined in. Not loud or staged, just gentle applause, a shared acknowledgement of what this moment represented. Jack paused, surprised, and looked at Evelyn. "Did you plan this?" he asked quietly. She shook her head, smiling. "No, but I think people remember, and they're glad to see you return." A few volunteers stepped forward to greet them, offering programs and glasses of sparkling cider. One young woman, no more than 20, leaned in and said, "Thank you for coming back, sir. Last year changed a lot of hearts." Jack nodded, touched, but still unsure how to respond. Evelyn took his hand and gently led him toward the dance floor. A slow song had begun. Strings and piano filled the room. She turned to face him and offered her hand, the same way she had that night a year ago. "Ready, Marine?" she asked. He placed his hand in hers and replied, "With you, always." They moved together, finding the rhythm easily. The room faded away as they danced, their bodies swaying in quiet unison. Around them, other couples joined in, and the floor became a sea of soft steps and gentle smiles. Jack felt the strength in her hand, the warmth of her body close to his, and something inside him settled with certainty. Midway through the evening, Claire arrived with a date of her own. She wore a sleek black dress and carried herself with calm confidence. She spotted her mother on the dance floor and gave her a little wave. Evelyn beamed. When the song ended, Jack and Evelyn returned to their table for a rest. They sat close, sipping cider, watching the crowd. Every few minutes, someone would come by to thank them, to share a story, or just to say how good it was to see them. Jack didn't feel like a guest anymore. He felt like a thread in the fabric of the night. As the evening went on, Jack stood and gave Evelyn his hand once more. "Let's dance again," he said. They took to the floor, just as a spotlight began to shine from above. The band shifted into a classic tune, one Jack remembered from years ago, something by Nat King Cole. He smiled as they moved, the music carrying them with ease. Others watched, but it didn't feel like a performance. It felt like a moment shared, honest and unguarded. Jack met Evelyn's gaze as they turned, her eyes steady and shining. "Thank you for not walking away that night," he whispered. "Thank you for letting me stop you," she replied. As the song reached its final note, the room seemed to hold its breath. Then came applause, light at first, then full and warm, filling the space like sunlight through an open window. Jack and Evelyn bowed slightly, then returned to their table hand in hand. The evening continued with laughter, dancing, and stories shared across candlelit tables. But the memory that would last, long after the night was over, was not the music or the applause. It was the way they looked at each other when no one else was watching. And the way, in that look, they had already chosen forever. The last song of the night began without introduction. There was no spotlight this time, no announcement from the band, just a soft cascade of piano notes followed by a gentle swell of strings. It was the kind of melody that didn't demand attention, only invited it. Couples across the room stood from their tables, some taking their partner's hand with a smile, others with a nod. There was no rush to the floor, only a graceful wave of motion as people moved together once more. Jack stood slowly, holding out his hand to Evelyn with quiet reverence. She rose to meet him, her expression calm, her eyes full of light. They had danced several times already, but this felt different. This wasn't for the crowd, or even for celebration. This one was for them. They stepped onto the dance floor, surrounded by others, but caught in their own quiet world. The music cradled them in rhythm, slow and thoughtful, and they moved as if each step had already been written. Jack's hand rested on the small of Evelyn's back, guiding with care, and her fingers nestled gently in his. For a long moment, neither spoke. There was no need. Jack looked into Evelyn's face and saw, not just the present, but the road that had brought them here. He remembered that first night, when she found him at the door, the way her voice cut through his silence and called him back to himself. He remembered their dance at the pier, the laughter over strawberry shortcake, the slow unfolding of trust between two people who had learned how to carry loss without being consumed by it. Evelyn's head rested against his shoulder now, and he could feel the rhythm of her breath. Each inhale and exhale matched his own. He held her a little tighter, not because he was afraid of losing her, but because he had come to understand what it meant to truly hold someone. Around them, others danced too. There were gray-haired couples who had likely shared 50 years together, their movements polished by decades of love. There were younger couples just beginning, moving with unsure feet and eyes full of promise. There were friends dancing with friends, parents with children, people who had found a space here not because they fit a mold, but because they dared to show up. The music swelled, then softened again, drifting into a final verse. Jack spoke quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I used to think love had one chapter," he said, "that after Melissa I was meant to just remember and be done." Evelyn lifted her head slightly to look at him, her hand tightening around his. "I thought the same," she replied, "that it would be disrespectful to feel joy again. But it's not," he said. "No," she agreed. "It's not." They turned slowly across the floor, feet in perfect time, eyes never leaving each other. In the hush of that final chorus, Jack felt something shift inside him. It wasn't a dramatic epiphany, not a thunderclap or a lightning bolt. It was quieter than that, a settling, a knowing. He was in love with Evelyn Hart. Not because she had filled a space left empty, not because she reminded him of what he had lost, but because she was her own story, her own light. And together, they had chosen to see one another for who they truly were, wounded and whole at once. The song came to a gentle end. The room did not erupt in applause. Instead, there was a stillness, the kind that only comes when people know they've witnessed something that matters. Jack and Evelyn stood there for a moment longer, then stepped back slightly, hands still linked. As they returned to their table, several guests stopped to speak to them. One man, a widower in his 70s, shook Jack's hand and said, "Thank you for showing us what it looks like to start again." A young woman approached Evelyn and whispered, "My mother came alone tonight. She saw you two and decided to stay." There were no long speeches, no grand declarations, just quiet gratitude passed from one heart to another. Later, after the room had emptied and the lights had dimmed, Jack and Evelyn stepped outside into the crisp night air. The stars were scattered across the sky like notes on a page. Jack took off his jacket and draped it over Evelyn's shoulders. She leaned into him, her arm tucked into his. "Do you want to go home?" she asked. He looked at her, then up at the stars. "Not yet." They walked slowly down the quiet street, their footsteps echoing against the pavement. The town was sleeping now, its shops shuttered, its traffic lights blinking red in rhythm. They passed the old bakery where Melissa used to buy cinnamon rolls, and Jack paused for just a second. He looked through the window, saw the darkened counter, and smiled. Evelyn noticed. "Memory?" she asked. "Yes," he said, "but not sadness, just a thread in the quilt." They kept walking until they reached the little park near the lake, where a few strands of fairy lights still flickered along the railings. It was quiet there, the water still, reflecting the night sky. Without a word, Jack turned to Evelyn and held out his hand once more. "Dance with me," he said. She stepped into his arms, and they moved together on the stone path, barefoot in their hearts. No music played, but it didn't matter. The rhythm was already inside them. As they danced beneath the stars, Evelyn rested her head against Jack's chest. "We've come a long way," she said. "We have," he replied, "and I'm ready for whatever comes next." They didn't speak again for a while. They let the silence say what needed saying, that they had found something real, that it had come slowly, honestly, that it would last, not because it was easy, but because it was chosen. When they finally stopped dancing, Jack kissed her forehead. "I love you," he said. Evelyn looked up at him and smiled, her eyes full. I know, she said. I love you too. They walked back toward the car, hand in hand, and the night held them like an old friend. In the quiet of the drive home, they didn't need to fill the space. They had said what mattered. At home, Jack placed the boutonniere on the mantel beside Melissa's photo. Not to replace anything, only to add to it, a symbol of what had been and what was now. A reminder that love, in all its forms, continued. And when he turned off the lights and stepped into the quiet bedroom where Evelyn now waited, he felt no guilt, only peace. They danced like people who had lost everything, then found something better. And in that finding, they had learned not just how to love again, but how to live